Welcome to the insurance series. I'm William Freitas, and today we've got Michael Joseph from Austbrokers Cyber Pro. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Great to be here, mate.
First time on the podcast, he says, in the last time.
Yeah.
But mate, Michael and I have been friends for quite some time. Back when I was an underwriter, we worked quite closely together. I was in Zurich at the time, and you were broking with Austbrokers. And you know, you have now since created Austbrokers Cyber Pro, focusing on cyber.
Yep.
And so naturally, we're going to dive into cyber, and you know what that looks like, what the market's looking like at the moment, what coverages clients need to think about.
Yep.
When placing cyber insurance in today's market. But also, I want to dive into your background, right? Because everyone's got a varied history as to how they got into insurance. So let's just start there, get an introduction, a little bit about you and what you do and how you got into insurance.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I mean, look, like everyone, essentially fell into insurance. Basically, 2009, finished a degree in economics. Not a great time to do an economics degree, 2009. We were just in the start of the GFC. But finished that degree, came out of uni, needed a job, obviously. So initially, I first thought, economics degree. Let's look at banking, investment banking, corporate banking. Didn't really understand what banking was, but it sounded good at the time. So did a few interviews, had some interviews with Macquarie Bank. Unfortunately, or fortunately now, didn't get the job. Which I look back on that and think one of those sort of sliding door moments, which was really good. And then I effectively went and started applying for just jobs in financial services. And essentially what happened there was recruitment agencies were sort of putting those jobs up behind the scenes, and all of a sudden you're talking to a recruiter, right? Without really knowing that's how you're applying. So went to a recruitment agency, and they did a sort of large day of, bring everyone in, go through everything with everyone, sort of pick out the people that they wanted to recruit for. Somehow I was chosen out of a group of however many. And they effectively then had a job to try and get me a job. So the first thing they sort of said to me is, well, what about insurance? I had not a clue about insurance at all. Like most people, I was 21, 22 years old. The only thing I'd heard about with insurance was home and contents, car insurance, the dodgy ads on TV about call centres and all those sorts of things. So first interview pretty much that I ever had was with my now business partner, Nick Codd, who runs Austbrokers Professional Service, who's a business partner in Austbrokers Cyber Pro and Infotech, one of our other businesses. And we essentially just got along well. I guess that's what I put it down to. I sort of brought myself a folder with all the stuff, prepared myself for everything. And Nick kind of said, look, put that away, mate. Let's just have a chat. We had a chat. He talked to me about what he did, which I had no idea about what he was talking about for the first half an hour. And then, the rest is kind of history. Nick and I sort of started working together back in 2009. We started Austbrokers Cyber Pro in 2017 on October. So if my maths is correct, about 8 years now. Yep. And then recently, 2 years ago, brought in two new business partners that have been with us for quite some time, Jared and Renee, and effectively started Austbrokers Infotech, so focusing on cyber and PI for technology companies, which, as you know, has got a little bit of a different requirement to normal companies.
Yeah, I think the thing that's most interesting to me is everyone that comes into insurance that has no idea about what insurance is, falls in love with it, stays, and then never leaves, really. But what is it for you that you enjoy about insurance? Why do you get up every day?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things. Look, obviously, building a business is great. Having skin in the game's fantastic as well. That's a real driver. Every time you're working with clients, working with insurers, there's a benefit behind the scenes for yourself and your business partners, which is great. But I love the social aspect of it as well. I mean, there's not a lot of jobs where you've got that sort of, yes, you do need to be at your desk. Yes, you do need to go through, complex things. But at the end of the day, you can sit down, whether it's with yourself or other friends that I've made in the industry, other brokers or retail brokers that we deal with, and of course with the insurers, and have a lunch, have a beer, those sorts of things. So I think it's a real social industry, but it is also an industry that requires a bit of demand in terms of workload and being on track with things and stuff like that. So,
and I'll also add to that, I think the thing that resonates with me that I have seen in you, that we have done together, I guess, is the technical element, right?
Yeah.
This isn't a dig to the insurance broking profession or industry necessarily, but brokers or advisors differ in how they provide their service. And I know in how you and I review risk, it's very technical. We read the PDS, we read the wording, and we go through the interpretations of what that might look like with the insurer and ensure that the client has the coverage. And I think that's, give credit where credit is due. That's something you've really focused on, focusing on coverage versus just price. Because I think insurance can be quite transactional, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I need insurance, I need professional indemnity, or I need cyber, go and get it.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you probably would have seen, insuring insurance brokers, there is quite a bit of risk in providing the wrong advice, or not providing advice at all, really, and just being quite transactional. And so I think that's, something that, I admire in you, and something that we've really enjoyed doing when we've worked together.
Yep.
Is the technical piece that you bring to it and make sure the client has coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly in the soft market that we're in now. I mean, it's very easy to be transactional in this market. Prices are coming down. Brokers can move things and move around to different providers very easily. As we predominantly are wholesale brokers, which isn't a big thing in Australia. It's quite big in the US. It's quite big in the UK. But for us, our retail brokers put a hell of a lot of trust in us to deliver those outcomes for them and their clients, right? And we've got a great network of retail brokers like yourselves and others that we've been dealing with for 10, 15 years, right? And those brokers really entrust us in providing them with the best cyber cover, the best cover for their tech clients, the best PI, the best D&O coverages. And we take a lot of pride in that. And that's why we sort of, building the business out, have really focused on real technical elements of cover, partnering with the right insurers, the right underwriting agencies, and building out and either having them subscribe to our wordings or endorsing their products. And then, of course, as assisting in claims management and managing claims at the time, because at the end of the day, the insurance policy is only as good as when the claim happens, right? And that's when you really get to see whether this policy is actually going to respond or not and assist the client in probably one of their greatest times and needs.
The thing that no one says about insurance is that it differs who you purchase insurance with. The advisor itself can make such a big difference as to what your coverage or what your insurance program looks like. As you've rightfully said, in the solutions that you provide, the solutions that you negotiate with insurers, they have particular coverages that have been negotiated that aren't off the shelf. And they're not things that ordinarily insurers will provide to your standard retail broker. And I think that's the thing that clients need to be very aware of is, are you getting the most competitive solution? And that's the challenge for clients who aren't necessarily educated in this space, particularly around cyber that continues to evolve pretty quickly. You and I will probably agree over the last 10, 15 years, clients, and particularly their CTOs, are saying, cyber insurance doesn't really cover very much. And that's kind of changed a little bit.
Yep.
The small business, I guess, environment has kind of caught up a little bit and understood what it is that cyber insurance actually covers. And it's very worthwhile having, naturally. But there's been some work to get there. And naturally, clients need to make sure they've got the coverage that they need, right?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I mean, look, we see it all the time. At the end of the day, a client is never going to get the same level of coverage that they're going to get if they go through an advisor or a broker, right? The insurers are just going to provide them with an off-the-shelf product. At claim time, you're not going to have that advocate in your corner. And we see that a lot. I mean, really, even to this day, we still see insurers providing, incorrect claims decisions on things where brokers need to get involved and challenge it and work through that process. And if you're purchasing that insurance policy directly, who are you as a client going to go to for that advocacy piece, right? So I think that's really important. And by using a broker as well, you're also getting a little bit more than insurance. You're getting a risk advice piece as well. Whether that's cyber, whether that's property, whether that's, PI from a contractual perspective, with the ability for brokers to bring in or advise them of some lawyers that they can use and all these sort of stuff. So there's a bit of an ecosystem there, and brokers are really good at that. They've got good relationships with insurers. They've got good relationships in the claim space. For us, for example, we know a lot of the law firms that get involved and act on either side for the claim. So you are dealing with someone when you're dealing with an advisor or broker that is well-rounded in that space and that can really stand up and fight for you as a business.
And this isn't a dig at any particular insurer, but as we do know, there are certain insurers that have different perspectives on how to pay claims.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it comes down to, we've learned over 15-ish years, I think 16 years now that I've been in the industry, there's certain insurers that we deal with and have dealt with through a softer hard and now another soft market. And there's certain insurers that we don't deal with, that we haven't had relationships with. And I'm very proud that all the insurers that we deal with have been very consistent in their approach. We've got great relationships with the underwriters, but importantly as well, the claims teams there.
I think that's what I enjoy advising clients on, not only the technical piece around intent as to what the policy is going to cover, but also, hey, we've had some claims with this insurer. We know they have a pay first mentality. Yep. They're not looking to decline immediately. They're happy to work with the client. And when we talk about cyber in specifics, we can go into incident response and what that looks like. But we'll get to that in a second. You mentioned the ecosystem that comes with a risk advisor, and this is what I really want to dive into, because when it comes to cyber, a lot of people think that they're just buying a piece of paper that might cover them at some stage, right? Which is very much how a business looks at a public liability insurance policy. They're like, I need this piece of paper to get out on the job site, and it might cover me one day if I need it. Whereas cyber insurance really needs to be viewed as the proactive approach to managing cyber risk in conjunction with your managed service provider, whatever it might be, right? Talk to us about the ecosystem that comes with purchasing cyber, because there's elements of pre-breach services that a client can implement within their business and improve their I guess, risk profile. And then there's obviously the insurance itself, which you purchase, that comes with the incident response. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And look, you make a good point there, Will, because 10 years ago, 12 years ago when cyber first came out, it was a piece of paper, right? The insurers, particularly a lot of the American insurers, bought out an Americanized version of the policy, tried to adapt it into the Australian landscape. And it was kind of a piece of paper. There started to be some claims and everyone sort of sat there and went, hang on a second, what do we do now? And the approach to cyber insurance is very different from a claims perspective to traditional insurance, right? Because a traditional insurance policy, whether it's professional indemnity, whether it's general liability, you're sort of sitting there, you get a notice, you get a claim, you engage some lawyers, and there's a long process through that. That whole journey. It can take months, sometimes years, for those claims to play out, right? The unique thing about cyber insurance is the policy, like you've mentioned, is very proactive. So if you kind of start where we kind of sit now, looking at the insurance piece, you've effectively got an incident response team, and I'll come back to the proactive risk management in a second, because that's something that's come probably over the last couple of years. But what you've got is you've got almost like a SWAT team, right? So an incident occurs. Within hour zero, you've got a dedicated incident response manager that forms part of the policy. Their effective job is to triage and understand the situation. Now, usually that's going to be a law firm, but not a traditional law firm that, an incident response typical approach. So, lively, active, working closely with the client, being very proactive in the approach. So you effectively have that incident response firm. Their role for the client is to basically project manage this incident and allow the client, even though they're going through a cyber incident, to try and run their business as best as they possibly can during this difficult time, right? So with that, you then get a whole array of vendors to assist. So those vendors aren't there, particularly the forensic IT vendors, to take over from what the managed service provider or the internal type IT person will do. They're more there to complement the situation, right? And particularly forensic IT is very important because they're going to delve into how the situation happened, what you can do to contain the situation, and they're going to provide a pretty detailed report about the situation, which is really important from a coverage perspective for the insurers to look at. And then obviously within that as well, you've got the lawyers that then switch over and do the legal side of things, so assist clients in understanding their obligations to regulators, to stakeholders, and importantly to their own clients. What we've seen a bit of a growing trend in some real strong contractual terms between clients. So even though you're a business and you've got 30 days to notify under the Privacy Act, you may have a contract which requires to notify that client that you've had a breach and their data's at risk within 24 or 48 hours. So you've got all that. I think importantly as well, the other vendors, you've got public relation vendors, but you've also got forensic accounting firms that are going to assist the business in putting together a comprehensive business interruption loss, if there is a business interruption loss for the business due to the cyber attack, essentially. And that's important because that's complicated, and I've seen that play out in real life. I do think that we will come to a point where there's going to be a more efficient way to do business interruption losses, particularly for small businesses, because the time it can take sometimes to put these reports together and to justify the loss or the additional cost of working becomes a little bit of a hazard for the SME business and takes a lot of resources away from that business. But that's effectively when I speak to clients about cyber insurance, I talk to them about that, because that's effectively what they're buying from a response on the policy. And when you ask an SME client in particular, what would you do if you had a cyber incident? They really don't have an idea, right? The first thing they talk about is, well, I'll speak to my IT provider. But the IT provider doesn't have all those things at their disposal, right? If we go back a step as well, obviously what these policies have now started to do over the last couple of years is they've started to work and effectively do preventative sort of scanning and risk management for clients to try and prevent claims or things from happening to clients right now. I think that's a real positive, but I also think it's something that you've got to look at with a little bit of caution, because just because a client has a clear scan doesn't mean they're a good risk. And just because a client might have a bad scan and might have a couple of issues doesn't mean they're a bad risk either. And I think it's really important for brokers in this day and age, when they're dealing with insurers that are pushing these scans out, to absolutely provide those scans to clients, but they've got to provide them with some context around those scans, right? Yeah. This is what it's scanning. It's only doing these things. There can be false positives. Let's now have a chat and let's talk through it either with ourselves or with the insurer about what that scan looks like and what things can be done from a client's perspective to reduce their cyber risk in general, right? But I think as well, you hit a good point, and the point is that none of this preventative risk from insurers, cyber insurance, incident response, takes away from what a client needs to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and that is really managing their cyber risk, right? Through their IT providers and working with their IT providers, ensuring that the board or the owners of the business in a small business scenario are across that. Because at the end of the day now, cyber is far more than just an IT problem. It's really become a business risk for the owners of the business and the board of the business as well.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree. I think we've definitely progressed past businesses thinking, I'm not online or I don't have a cyber risk. It's more of a privacy risk really than it is cyber per se. Yeah. But let's take a step back. I want to dive back into claims and incident response and proactive measures, but let's just take a step back and say, well, what does cyber actually cover? Because at its core, it can be one thing, and then you can add on additional layers that are specific to a client. But take us through some of the coverages that you see and you deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cyber really is, and you kind of said it before, there's a data risk element to cyber and a system risk element to cyber. So, in the early days, you'd get a construction company that says, well, I don't hold any data. I've got a couple of employees, don't hold any data, don't need cyber insurance. But the important thing is that that's only kind of half the policy, right? The other half of the policy is, well, if you've got a computer and if you're connected to the internet, which 99.99% of businesses in this day and age are, and your systems went down for whatever reason, how would you operate as a business is the real question, right? And I think we can safely say it would be very difficult for most businesses to operate at the same level of efficiency that they do without their computer networks. I think that's pretty much every business would agree with that when you speak to them about that.
Yeah.
So really, what does a cyber policy cover? I mean, look, the most important thing under the cyber policy is the first party cover. And that's kind of what we've spoken about already with the incident response piece. But it's going to provide cover for those privacy notification and crisis management expenses. So if a client does have a breach and there's data exposed, they're going to have obligations under the Privacy Act. Even if they don't because they're too small, they're going to want to do something about that and look into that. So they're going to need legal costs. They're going to need advisors on board, an incident response manager. They're going to need potentially notification letters to be drafted or things put out on their website. So that covers that privacy risk element. And then what you see from a claims perspective is, depending on the situation, they may have an interruption to their systems through a cyber event, right? Really, unless there's been an accidental data leakage or something like that, usually there's going to be a malicious actor at the end of this that's basically interrupted their networks, via ransomware, or just got into their systems and tried to misdirect payments and funds and things like that, exfiltrate data. So you've got data restoration cover, which basically the cost to restore, recollect, recreate all that data. A lot of that is done by the business itself in conjunction with external assistance. You've got business interruption cover if the business is down for days, for weeks, or not operating as it would, and there's a loss of profit to the business. That's covered along with an additional cost of working, which is, of course, your contractors need to be brought in, manual workarounds need to happen. And then you've got cover for ransomware. And that includes payment of ransomware. Now, obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. Most insurers and most of the lawyers that work with the client in that regard, and we've been part of quite a few of these, there's all sorts of sanction checks and legal things that need to go on now. And as you're aware, there's a mandatory ransomware reporting requirement now that government have brought in the past few months. But you've got coverage for that. But importantly, you've actually got coverage for threat negotiators to actually find out what's going on, provide intel, engage with the threat actor, which is a really important thing to understand. Are these people serious? What data do they have? Will they do what they say they will do? So that's your first party cover. And that's really there from hour zero, to bring the business back to the level it was prior to the cyber event as quickly as possible and wrap as many experts around as required. And then obviously you've got the third party cover, right? So, once that all is finished, you've still got this risk of potential litigation and claims, whether that's from a regulator, whether that's from stakeholders, whether that's from clients, whether that's from a vendor that's been infected by an issue. So privacy and security liability cover. And of course, coverage for fines and penalties if they're insurable at law, and the cost to respond to regulators and respond to those third parties. So if we look at where are the claims at the moment, I mean, most of the claims activities in that first party cover, I'd say 80 to 90% of it. But interestingly, we're starting to see the third party side of things starting to be a bit more active now. You've probably heard that the Privacy Commissioner has just, as of a week or two ago, handed down their first fine to a business for around $5.8 million. So regulators in this country now are starting to get quite serious in relation to this stuff.
And I mean, a lot of those, I guess, publicised events, fines that get handed down. They're relatively larger businesses per se, and they're often fines to really make a stand, I guess. Yep. But I want to dive into some claims examples, particularly on the smaller end, because I think
absolutely.
a lot of smaller businesses, particularly around that system piece, they're like, well, if we're breached, then we'll just continue operating. They're not quite present to, what an actual impact will look like. And so we'll dive into a bit of the claims process in a minute and some examples. But talk us through the buying process, right? Because right now, I do feel like it's a little bit outdated. Clients will fill out a proposal form. Let's say their broker sends them a proposal form. Yep. They often don't get advice from the broker as to how to complete this form. The form is quite technical. They often send that on to their managed service provider. Their managed service provider fills out certain sections of that proposal form as best they can. And then the client signs off on it and says, here you go, here's my proposal form. And then naturally the insurer uses that to get a quote.
Yep.
Then you get some quotes and then you might put a policy in place. Whereabouts does the pre-breach services come in play? And I know you've got some services as well, with policies that come through. There's different providers that can do penetration tests and the like, which are some things that insurers want to see prior to binding. Take that process on from there, and how do you see that changing as well?
Yeah, look, I think the days of filling out proposal forms for cyber risks are numbered, but like everything in insurance, we're a bit behind. It takes some time, right? I think the insurers have got quite good at taking the proposal form, but then applying their own review of that from a scanning tool perspective. And when they're picking things up, that's coming back to the broker, who's then being able to pass that on to the client, like we said before. Obviously, the key there is the broker really needs to be telling the client what that scan means, right? Not just flicking a piece of paper on. Because when you flick that piece of paper on, then if there are false positives, you create this tension between IT person, client, and broker. And all of a sudden, this whole process of purchasing cyber insurance starts to unravel a little bit. I think from a pre-breach perspective, because we deal in the incident response space in terms of managing claims, we've got good relationships with quite a lot of IT vendors. So we really can and do recommend to clients, if they're looking to have an audit of their IT provider or just a general penetration test or security audit, or want a health check or a review like that, we've got plenty of vendors that can assist in that. So that's always really important, because I think what goes really well with a proposal form is all the additional information that clients provide. So, when we broke our larger risks, most of the clients there are providing us with not just a proposal form. They're providing us, a lot of the times, with redacted things because it's quite confidential, but they're providing us with information including, redacted results, their latest pen test, but we've implemented all these things and we're remediating these things. They've provided us with plans for the next 12 months of what their IT uplift and processes and procedures look like. All those sorts of things are really helpful when you're actually pushing that out to the insurer. I guess in the soft market now, insurers are very hungry for business. Premiums are going down. So there's probably been a little bit less discipline from an underwriting perspective in the last sort of 12 months to 24 months. So insurers have become a little bit more lax in, if you don't have this control, we'll still write you, but can you get it in place? I don't think that's a good thing. I think the industry as a whole needs to stand firm in all the really good work we did in the hard market, i.e., these are the controls and processes and procedures we need to see if you're going to be insurable. Because I think at the end of the day, if we have a much higher set of controls and processes for clients, it's going to be better for everyone, right?
Absolutely.
Including the client themselves.
And the industry can continue to refine and improve on its process, right? And it's interesting, I want to touch on the scanning component, right? Yes, I do believe insurers have gotten a little bit better at using their own tools in-house to scan a client And now, particularly with the introduction of AI, I've seen various different companies that I've met with provide a lot more detail around what a client looks like. But if you're a broker listening, like, take that with so much caution, because as you said, it can provide a false positive. You mentioned sort of unraveling that insurance process. I actually think it can really invalidate the expertise or the valor of what cyber insurance can do, right? Because I've seen situations where a report comes across my desk and it's like, well, firstly, it's all external. Okay, a few domains haven't been updated, and you pass it on to the IT team. The IT team then have a debate with the board, and then they actually go, well, actually, no, this isn't an issue. This is an issue that happened 6 months ago. We've patched it up. It's been improved. It's no longer an issue. It's not an internal scan, so it is very face value.
It is,
So it's very hard to rely on these scans. So yes, there's like a little bit of a value add, but I think at its core, what really matters, and I think this is what insurance is about, and I think this is where cyber has lost its way a little bit. Cyber is there to cover a catastrophic event. Insurance is there to cover a catastrophic event that businesses can't afford to get out of. Otherwise, they'd become insolvent, right? And that's the way I think you've really got to see insurance. Not something that you can use every day as like a transaction.
Exactly,
Otherwise, your insurance cost goes up through the roof every year renewal. You need to look at it as something, okay, if we have a large event that we can't afford to absorb in our balance sheet, then that's what insurance is there for.
Correct,
And so really that's what you're buying with cyber insurance. It's not a scan that, is helping you, improve your risk slightly. It's more so what you buy with insurance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think the important thing is look, the scans are useful, but you're 100% right. They've got to be provided to the client in the right context. I think the most important thing about bringing the whole cyber insurance piece together for the client is to be honest, it's the broker, right? And the big problem that we have is that brokers are still not understanding cyber insurance. It's still an insurance that every single policy in the market has different language, has different things. It's not like a general liability policy where things are relatively the same for all insurers. And I think as well, brokers have got a challenge, like general brokers have a real challenge, because how much time can they actually put into learning cyber insurance when it makes up 2, 3, 4% of their book of business, right? As we know, soft market, brokers are working harder than ever. There's so much stuff going on at the moment. You're having to remarket things, having to work closely with insurers and clients, and then to actually have to sit down and really get technical into a cyber insurance policy. I mean, that's all we do, and it takes a lot of time, and we find it difficult to find the time to do that, right? So, but I do think that we're at a cusp now where the excuse for brokers that, well, it's a bit technical, I don't really need to know about MFA and how, like, I think that excuse, if you're telling your clients about this product, you need to have a basic understanding and a basic knowledge. You don't have to be an IT person. You don't have to explain to the client, you must deploy it in this way, shape and form. That's for their IT people to do. But you've got to be able to speak to a client and say, look, here are the things that insurers need to see if we're going to work with you and get you coverage. And the better your risk looks, the better outcomes you're going to get from a premium perspective. But importantly, and I'm sure we'll come onto this, from a coverage perspective as well, because now is the time as a broker to be getting as much cover thrown into policies as you possibly can while the market's soft.
I 100% agree. It's not just focusing on reducing that cost. Sure, soft market brings additional competition. Every insurer at the moment is aggressive to write business, and sure, it's a competitive process. It can help with rate or pricing. But you can't forego coverage for sure. Now, if we continue that conversation around the buying process, where I think a lot of brokers or clients fall through is once they buy that cyber insurance policy, they forget about it. There is no claims management process or plan. It doesn't fit within their incident response plan if they've got one. They're not aware of the 1-800 number that you can call as part. I think it's a really big missing.
And to be honest, that's on the broker, to be fair. So the brokers sold this policy. They now need to go through and sort of work with the client on making sure that they're aware of that, right? So it's about saying to the client, here is the incident response process. Here's the hotline. Here's my number, right? As your broker, if you need me, you've got to put this into your incident response plan. Send me a copy, even if you don't want to send the whole copy of, the executive summary piece of your plan showing that, so we have it on our file, so we know what to do as well at the time of a cyber event. And I think that's important. I mean, for our larger clients, and I know you can't do this on every single client because it's just a time thing, but most of our larger clients, once they buy a cyber policy, will have an onboarding call with the incident response team, right? And the incident response team will take them through the workflow, take them through what they do, how they operate. It's a great thing because the client can also ask a lot of questions about, different scenarios. Some of the incident response teams are great. They'll actually do a quick little free review of the client's incident response plan, give them some tips and tricks on things that they've got to be looking at and managing in that plan. But it's really important that brokers don't just sell this policy and then, I know there's the thing, you've got to move on to the next one, obviously, but you've also got to make sure that the client understands what they're buying and how to access that policy, right? Because the last thing you want is a client that has a cyber event, tries to manage it themselves, comes to you 2 or 3 weeks later, and then straight away you're on the back foot. And from experience and seeing this with certain clients in the past, in the early days, it's the one thing insurers hate is basically getting a bill for X amount of dollars and having no oversight or no involvement in that, right? It becomes a much more challenging piece for the client to get their money, for the broker to sort of push to get the insurer to pay that claim in its fullest. And in many instances, that's how a client would respond if they're not aware of Correct. Having that incident response solution there. And I think some brokers aren't really necessarily educating their clients on the impact of making that phone call. In many instances, that phone call doesn't mean you've triggered a claim or you've started paying excess or that it's going to impact your renewal costs because costs have gone up. It doesn't necessarily mean that. In many instances, the insurer is just happy to look at what it is, see if it is an issue in the first instance. Look, all the incident response providers that we use through our policies, whether that's our own ACP policy for our SME facility or the panel of insurers that we use, they all will provide that initial 15, 20-minute free call, right? Where a client says, look, I think I might have an issue. I don't know if it's an issue yet. Can we have a quick chat? This is what these guys do for a living, right? So they're happy to jump on a call. We jump on a call. The best case scenario is have a look at it, monitor it. It's nothing, it goes away. And if it is a worst case scenario, then instantly we can get some assistance for the client and we can start helping them manage the situation. Because the quicker we start managing the situation, the better claims outcome we're going to get for the client, but also the less amount of damage that it's going to be doing to the client's business from a cyber event perspective, right? Yeah. We've seen instances where, clients have got issues and we've been able to assist them and it's kind of stopped that issue occurring in its tracks or going further. So they've gone from potentially having their whole system shut down and not being able to operate to being able to remove that threat actor pretty early on in the piece. And one of the things that we didn't really chat about too much in terms of the coverage component was the social engineering fraud component. Now, naturally, there are various different policies that can potentially provide coverage. And I'm looking at the management liability and crime section. But I'll ask you really quickly, where do you think it should sit, cyber or ML? I'm a cyber purist, so it should be a crime issue. But you can't not have social engineering cover now in a cyber policy, particularly for an SME client, right? Because you need to have that cover in there for the client. Best case scenario, they've got an ML policy with it, they've got a cyber policy with it. We all know insurers sublimit that cover, right? So having 2 sublimits of 250, if my maths is correct, that's $500,000 for the client, which is a good situation for them. But look, even now in the soft market, larger corporate clients, they really used to not get that cover. They'd buy it under crime. It's even starting to come out in that now, where larger corporate clients are going, well, give me $250,000 or $500,000 of cybercrime cover under my policy just because the insurers will at this stage. And in managing these claims in the past,
Is the issue not, though, sometimes whether the client knows it's a social engineering issue, and so you need some form of incident response to
100%.
associate that?
Yeah.
You're not going to have that in managed liability policy.
No, you're not. No, you're not. I mean, typical social engineering issues, they all effectively start from some sort of business email compromise issue, whether it's on the insured system or their customer system. And until there's an investigation done, no one knows where it's happened. And of course, because there's money that's gone missing, similar with customer invoice fraud or push payment type fraud that insurers provide now, no one really knows who's at fault until there's an investigation done. And that's quite an important thing, right? So that's where the cyber policy kicks in. Yeah. Look, customers have got and clients have got a lot better at managing social engineering issues in terms of not misdirecting the funds. But in the last 12 months, I've seen that starting to reverse a little bit. And a lot of that is to do with just really, really good social engineering techniques, use of AI, but threat actors have got really good now. I mean, the problem with these threat actors is it's a very lucrative business, right? So once they understand clients are got a process in place to risk manage out of that risk, they're going to try and circumnavigate that process somehow, and it will take some time, but they will get there. And probably in the last 12 months, we've seen a fair uptick in that misdirection of funds issue, which for small businesses is a real problem because a small business, if they misdirect or lose $100,000, $200,000, that can be the profit of that business for a 12-month period, right? Yeah. That could be the business owner's wages after they've paid all their staff. I can't pay myself now for the next month, 2 months, 3 months because I've suffered this loss.
Let alone the friction that it can cause with their clients.
Absolutely.
And what some of those large projects could look like if they lose a client because of a payment issue. So it's certainly a big
And look, I think just to the last point on that, Will, some policy wording still to this day, which amazes me, have got conditions built in or more so exclusions now because they understand under unfair contract terms they probably can't have conditions built into the policies, and Section 54 always assists the consumer in that regard. But there's still exclusions built into policies around if you didn't do these 3 or 4 things, your claim's not going to be paid, right? From a misdirection of funds perspective. Every single misdirection of funds claim that we see is because someone hasn't done those things, right? So you've got to be really careful as a broker and look at those policies. The other thing we're seeing sometimes is in this soft market, brokers are getting alternative quotes or whatever it may be from other insurers. We see it when our retail brokers are attacked. It's half the price, but all the cybercrime cover's been taken out. So that's another thing you've got to think of, because if a client's going to have a cyber event in the SME space, there's probably a 65-70% chance it's going to be some sort of business email compromise. And then you've probably 30-40% chance that it's going to involve some sort of misdirection of funds. So it's a pretty important cover to have. And
it's interesting you mentioned that when we talk about duty of disclosure, naturally a lot of those questions are going to be asked within the proposal form.
Correct, yep.
And sometimes business owners aren't completing those forms. Yep. It's their outsourced IT team. And so I think that's an interesting landscape as to where liability sits from that perspective. But what you've kind of rightfully pointed out is provided that there is a process, provided that the business has thought about this risk and implemented certain procedures to ensure that it's a reduced risk that will occur, even if one of your employees, for example, doesn't follow that process and misappropriates those funds, it's covered.
Yep.
So,
and that's effectively what you're buying insurance for, right? You've got your risk management in place. We all know that risk management isn't fail-proof. Things can happen within a business, and we all know in the cyberspace the weakest is the human factor, right? It's just humans being humans and being rushed and not calling the correct number or skipping through a process because they've got 3,000 other things to do that day. And that is what insurance is there for, right? That's why a business, like you sort of came on to before, you're not there. The insurance policy isn't there to be a risk management policy. It's there to basically complement that and deal with that residual risk exposure that exists to all businesses.
And whilst I'm on the topic of proposal forms, I don't know what your take is on this. You briefly alluded to it. that, sure, proposal forms are a little bit outdated, and insurance in general, the industry is a little bit behind the times. But I have started seeing in different regions where insurers are testing out using applications to be downloaded into the client's system or server, which then does an internal pen test versus just an external scan. I think that'll be an interesting perspective in terms of collecting information versus asking for a proposal form and relying on what those disclosures are. I can see that occurring, and it'll be an easy way to go, okay, cool, here you go, via API, remote, connecting to our system, we'll do a review and we'll give you a price on the spot. I can see that occurring.
I think the good thing about cyber and cyber insurance in general is it is one of the areas in the insurance market that is innovating constantly, right? Insurers, brokers, everyone's looking to, for ways to increase the sell of cyber insurance, to increase the education around cyber insurance, to increase the ease of transaction, right? And it is, like a lot of clients, when you send them a proposal form, they're like, oh, another insurance proposal form. And like you've said, the IT provider does his bit, they get it back. And, if a client's not motivated to buy cyber insurance, it becomes an excuse for them just to put it to the side. If a client's motivated and they need it, they'll do what they need in order to get that. But I do think, moving forward in the next, 3 to 5 years, I think we'll definitely see a much more tech-savvy approach to sort of underwriting cyber and collecting cyber information from clients.
Yeah, I agree. Talk to me about claims. What are some claims examples that you've seen recently on both the smaller end and the larger end? Because, sure, everyone sees the high-ticket breaches, Qantas, Medibank, Optus, you name it, right?
Yep.
But what often doesn't get publicised is your small business that gets taken down effectively for a period of time, or has a ransomware attack, or has a breach in their private information. Have you got some examples that you can go through?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if we break it down into sort of 3 areas, these are the 3 areas we see claims, and I'll sort of run through the sorts of claims without naming people. But look, SME businesses, probably 60 to 70% of the claims activities in that business email compromise / misdirection of funds piece, right? And we see that pretty regularly. Like we've had probably over the last 6 months, we've dealt with 5 or 6 of them under our SME facility. Interestingly, in those circumstances, 3 or 4 of them, there was the threat actors had actually bypassed the insured's MFA applications. So that's something that clients really need to start being wary of. Is yes, you've got MFA in place, but having it configured right and having staff trained on the use of MFA. And in those circumstances, with clients, some there was a misdirection of funds, some there wasn't a misdirection of funds. But one that sticks out to me was basically an accounting firm. There was about $120,000 of funds misdirected, but that's the one piece. The piece that kind of kept the client awake and effectively took some time to resolve was the fact that they'd been able to breach the mailbox and exfiltrate thousands and thousands of emails and data, right? So the client had an obligation to effectively look into that with the incident response, do the data reviews, all those sorts of things. And in the end, they actually had to make a notification to the OAIC. They had to notify the clients. They had to replace, I think, 13 or 14 driver's license, which were caught up in that breach. So, and we're talking about an accounting firm that probably generates $2.5–3 million of business. Now, typically, they wouldn't be covered under the Privacy Act, but because they hold tax file numbers, there's an exemption there. So that for a small business, and that approach was quite a lengthy process, right? The misdirection of funds stuff, we kind of saw that early. We knew what that was going to cost. The insurer wanted to do their checks and balances on you, had the procedures they did. That was paid out relatively quickly. But what took some time was working through that data exfiltration. Do we need to notify? If we do need to notify, who do we actually need to notify, right? We're not going to notify 2,000 clients when only 100 of them have had information compromised. And then obviously some of that ID replacement and those sorts of things. So that's a typical SME claim. That one, I would say, from an exfiltration perspective, was probably at the higher end of what we see, but very typical. And again, we're just seeing clients, and we're all guilty of this, but just storing so much data in their mailboxes, right? And this client did have MFA in place. They're on Office 365. They had all the right controls in place. They just got unlucky and a human error element with the MFA. So that's sort of your business email compromise. I mean, look, an SME business can kind of continue to keep going through that process, right? So those sorts of claims are not going to devastate the business, right, and shut the business down. But where the business gets shut down and where we see the terrible claims are ransomware, right, most of the time. And that is a situation, and we've dealt with some very big claims for very big clients, and then we've dealt with some not so big claims in terms of dollar value for smaller clients. But these smaller clients are really at a point of, if we can't get ourselves up and running, we can't move forward as a business, right? And unfortunately with the ransomware piece, it's a challenging one, because we've seen multiple times where the IT provider has probably been at fault a little bit, which brings other challenges to it, because what you've got is you've got an IT provider that may or may not hand over certain information that's required. That can be frustrating. There's, of course, a bit of tension between them and the client. We're paying you to keep our system secure. You haven't done something. We've got this massive issue on our hands. The other thing I think is interesting is I hear sometimes with clients when I talk to them about ransomware, they say, we've got great backups. We will be back up and running within 48 hours. Don't you worry about it, right? I've never been involved in a ransomware event where a client has within 48 hours thought as if the event never happened. Right? Even if they can get their systems back up and running, there's almost always going to be elements of their systems which aren't working. They're going to have to, redo elements of their system, re-put in data. Very time-consuming thing, right?
Particularly if you're doing it as the business or you're outsourcing it, to
exactly.
your service provider.
And look, we're talking about SME businesses here, right? So it's not like this is a corporate business with 1,000 employees where they can just take 10 people off and go, right, you're going to deal with this cyber event, right? That's what you're going to do. We've got 990 other people that are just going to keep working. Like, we're talking small businesses that might have 5, 6, 7 staff like ourselves, right? If I had to take away 3 or 4 of my staff just to deal with this, I mean, we would come to a grinding halt. And I'm sure most small businesses would. So the ransomware side of things is really challenging. And I think as well, it's quite confronting for clients, because they are actually in a situation where they're having to make decisions about whether they actually pay these threat actors. And I think one of the great things about the insurance policy is it allows them and assists them to make an informed decision, right? And we have had clients pay ransoms to protect the integrity of the data that's been taken, to get themselves back up and running much quicker than possible. And in some cases, they've had no choice.
And it's all a negotiation, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And look, that's, again, where the policy comes in and the threat negotiators come in. Like we see, we had a financial services firm down in Victoria about a year ago, and they ended up having to pay the ransom, but it started off at around 250,000, and we were able to get it down to, I think it was 110, 120,000 at the end. But they had no choice. Some of the data was quite sensitive. There were elements of their system that they just could not get back, and they needed those elements to continue to run their business, right? So that's the sort of ransomware piece. And then obviously what we're seeing as well, and I think what is starting to come out, is the supply chain piece, right? Whether that's IT supply chain risk or just non-IT supply chain risk, there's always been IT supply chain risk. MSP goes down, client can't operate. I think that's quite obvious and clients see that. But I think what clients are seeing more of now is they're seeing, I've been dealing with that vendor or supplier for years. Of course we share data. Of course we, have a relationship that, requires us to provide them with things. They provide us with things. That vendor's had a breach and they've told me about it, and all my clients' data's been exposed. Okay, what do I do here? Now that vendor is typically not going to be all that open and forthright about what's happening, because they actually don't know what's happening themselves. They're going through an investigation phase themselves. So again, where a good cyber insurance policy, it really assists the client and helps them ask the right questions, get the right information so that they can do an assessment and deal with their obligations under the Privacy Act. So they're the sort of three areas where you're going to get most of your claims. I guess what I would say is the SME space, and the reason I think it's so important to, whether you have cyber insurance or not is a business decision, but at least understand the value of it. These claims in the SME space can take a business out, right? In the big end of town, it's unlikely. I mean, there's going to be a lot of reputational damage and harm, but Qantas, for example, is not going to fall over tomorrow because they had that data breach, right? Yep. Whereas a small business, it can be the difference between them actually surviving and moving forward or shutting themselves down, because after that cyber event, the reputational risk can last months and months and months. And if there's no income that's being generated in the business, it can only hold on for so long, right?
And I've started seeing requirements contractually, as you briefly sort of mentioned too earlier. The requirement for cyber insurance is being, implemented in all customer contracts, particularly if you're working with government, for sure.
Government, banks, any big clients now are sort of asking for cyber.
And when I start seeing that, I start thinking, okay, well, we might actually get this to a point where it is a bit like of a public liability that you can't actually trade unless you've got cyber risk protection. Do you see that going that way?
Yeah, look, I think I think there's a little way to go yet, but if you're doing any work for any of the banks, any government, defense, any large businesses, typically there's a requirement now for cyber insurance. I think the challenge sometimes where we see these contracts is the requirement for the limit is ridiculous compared to the risk, and asking a small business that's basically got $100,000, $200,000 contract with this larger business to buy $20 or $30 million of cyber, even in this soft market, is not really a realistic approach. Yeah. But that's where we as brokers come in and have that discussion with the client and help them talk to their client in the contract and say, look, this is what we can do. And most of the time there can be a negotiation there. But I do think, particularly anyone that's holding, and most businesses now when they're trading with each other, holding some sort of data to be able to, basically do business with each other. The requirements for cyber insurance are now definitely starting to come into contracts, particularly with tech businesses as well.
I think it's a huge takeaway that business owners really need to grasp. Put insurance to one side, even if you don't have cyber insurance yourself as a business owner. The businesses that you deal with, think about the businesses that you deal with, your accountant, your lawyer, your financial planner, they're all collecting very sensitive information about you. Ask them whether they've got cyber insurance in place or how it is that they manage their privacy risk. Because it is your risk, effectively. It's your data that you're giving to them, your client's data that you're giving to them. And so you really want to think about how you're managing that risk, then thinking about insurance as well. That's a huge takeaway. And if you haven't got a claims management plan or thought around how it is that you respond to an incident, obviously rely on your insurance, but brokers really need to be helping clients here, because we see it too often. I mean, it's an opportunity for us naturally, but clients really need to get their head around how it is they can respond and better use this insurance.
Absolutely.
Michael, thank you for coming on the show. First and definitely not your last. I think, mate, you are very well versed on cyber, naturally, given the time that you've invested in it and the amount of years that you've specialised in it. So, mate, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and no doubt if people want to listen, they can reach out to you on LinkedIn if they like. And appreciate you coming on, mate.
Perfect. Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.